Old Virginia conjures up images of gentility, wealth, abundance, and good and easy living on the land, the type of bucolic existence that would allow for the pursuit of humanistic learning and its attendant virtues. Such is how William Rasmussen describes the concept of Old Virginia in his book, Old Virginia, The Pursuit of a Pastoral Ideal. And that image of Virginia would be incomplete without the Virginia gentleman, born to one of perhaps 300 familiar units who controlled the state, nearly all of which trace descent to one or more of 21 surnames like Lee, Custis, Randolph, and Carter. Known for his lavish hospitality, beautiful country manner, political talents, and easygoing ways, this gentleman was the cream of the American crop, the gentry that ruled the frontier and developed early America. These were the topping men of Old Virginia, and thus of America. In myth, such men were aristocratic cavaliers, barons of past ages lounging on their porches and drinking toddies as gorgeous belles flitted about and blooded racehorses raced boldly or grazed lazily in their endless fields. This was, in such myth, a transplanting of courtly European life to America, the pinnacle of aristocratic social life in the New World, a lifestyle of balls, courtship, and romance enlivened by adventure. Clifford Doughty, describing this mythical man in his The Great Plantation, says, quote, "The protagonist was always Old Massa, ridden with debts and vice, but jealous of personal honor, always booted and spurred with a whip in one hand and julep in the other. This high-born and arrogant wastrel kept a stable of blood horses, on which he repeatedly ruined himself by betting, and when he wasn't out dueling under the live oaks, he was entertaining friends with prodigal lavishness." End quote. Some of this was true. There was romance with ladies and camaraderie over cups of punch or brandy. Their fox hunts and hospitality amongst the class was lavish. Elegance was prized, virtue trained, and cultivation demanded. But it would be a mistake, and indeed a disservice to these bold and visionary political leaders, competent planters, brave military leaders, and great men, to merely imagine them as dashing royalist aristocrats, lounging amidst unbounded acres in the New World, free from exaction and genius alike. To strip away the varnish of myth and romance is to reveal a different world. These were not just well-heeled gentlemen strutting on their imported Arabian stallions or haughtily carried by coaches and six, bedecked with liveried servants. They were men as talented as any America has seen, astute managers of their plantations, intrepid political leaders able to challenge the might of the world's greatest empire but a few generations after their new world had been built, and well-educated frontier political theorists who designed a lasting republic, an exceptional achievement based on what they had taught themselves in lonely country house libraries in the little college of William and Mary. Make no mistake, these were great men, possessed of mannered cultivation and the habit of command, book learning and immense courage alike. Such was the Virginia gentleman, as we will discuss today. So, yes, we are taking another brief pause from the Lees of Virginia and their story. After finishing up the story of the Stratford Hall line in the last episode with the life of Francis Lightfoot Lee, I wanted to mix it up a bit for variety while sticking to the theme and also cover the culture of the men of this class. As I mentioned, the Virginia Gentry frequently in pretty much all these shows, and will continue to as the First Family series continues. But I haven't done an in-depth show discussing what sort of men they were and what the culture of the Virginia Gentry was. I figured today's show would be appropriate, as we'll continue in the next episode. We'll discuss what we can learn from this class, the Virginia Gentry. And then after that, we'll get back on track with the Lee family series and cover the Lee-Sylvania Lees, leading through Light Horse Harry and Robert E. Lee, and then the final Lees of public note that followed him before moving to a new First Family eventually. So you'll have to stay tuned to find out which, but is the concept of the Virginia Gentry and their culture and what they were like will keep coming up. Discussing it here first seemed appropriate. That way I can reference it in the future, or you can reference it in the future. So, to begin with the reality of the Virginia gentleman, we must examine his origins. Unlike the legends, as we discussed somewhat in the episode on the Norman heritage of the Lee family, the patriarchs of the first families of Virginia were not chivalric barons arriving as genteel squires, fortunes intact and hatred of Cromwell burning in their hearts. Most were royalists of spirit to some extent, and a few could claim close ties to the British gentry, though generally not the titled aristocracy. But the vast majority of the first families of Virginia, the Carters, the Byrds, the Lees, the Randolphs, the Pages, and the Burwells, were founded not by fleeing lords, but by ambitious, hard-headed, and acquisitive English merchants, captains, younger sons of middle-class tradesmen, and provincial factors. Often, their fathers were the younger son descendants of the landed gentry who had gone into trade to make their way in the world after being cut out of the estate by primogeniture. Seeking to turn their bloodlines into landed gentry once again, they sent their sons, or their sons went voluntarily, to the endless acres of the New World to acquire vast estates. These men arrived upon the shores of the Chesapeake in the 17th century. Most of the first families arrived somewhere around the 1640s, not to preserve ancestral fortunes and proud royalist traditions, but to seek their fortunes. They were self-made entrepreneurs operating on the perilous edge of the world, hoping to grow as wealthy as the landed elite they gradually sought to emulate. As T.H. Breen put it in his book, Tobacco Culture, quote, "However civilly the great planters may have behaved, it is doubtful that any self-respecting European nobleman would have mistaken even the wealthiest Virginians for aristocrats. For one thing, their genealogies did not bear close examination. The Virginia gentry traced its roots back to the mid-17th century when the sons of middling English merchants traveled to the Chesapeake in search of economic opportunity. Many of these migrants were roughnecks, men in a hurry to get rich, and none too particular about the means they employed to achieve their goal. Tobacco provided good, though not spectacular, returns to those newcomers who could obtain the labor of white indentured servants." End quote. That was important, for the men who founded the gentry lines arrived with a few advantages, even if they weren't cavaliers clad in calfskin boots and feather-plumed hats. For one, as most were the sons of merchants, whose forefathers were members of the gentry, they arrived with connections to merchant houses, sources of capital, and so on. Further, that meant they often arrived with a bit of capital of their own to use. Rarely a large fortune, it was nevertheless enough for them to pay for land and for importing indentured servants whose 50-acre head rights they could claim, as we covered before in our episode on tobacco culture. Armed with modest sums of capital, sharp commercial instincts, and strategic connections around the budding empire, from the West Indies to London, Guinea to Glasgow, they systematically used the headright system to amass huge tracts of fertile tidewater land. As Lewis B. Wright notes in The First Gentleman of Virginia, quote, "Although many of the ruling families were descended from ancestors who could boast no better heritage than a successful connection with trade, this ancestral shortcoming did not prevent their gaining positions of honor in the new land, provided they had land and money to support their claims. For it was capital, which enabled settlers to bring in servants and clear rich tracts of tobacco land, that determined the Virginia aristocracy of the 17th and early 18th centuries." End quote. This mattered, for getting on the capital creation flywheel meant one could escape the dire fate of a small yeoman in late 17th century Virginia, ever at risk of fluctuations in price of an overproduced crop, meaning one would lose one's land or make nothing in profit after a year's back-breaking work, unable to raise the capital to acquire servants and make money on volume rather than price. Acquiring enough labor to become a large planter was easy once one started bringing over even just a couple of indentured servants. And when this class crystallized in the mid-17th century, it was indentured servants, not slaves, but that required having an early bit of capital, which these men, the first family founders, arrived with. From there, the ranks began to sort into small farmers and big planters, as Philip Alexander Bruce notes in his Institutional History of Virginia in the 17th century, saying, quote, "They had inherited all its social peculiarities, from the division in social ranks to the popular indoor and outdoor pastimes. No order of nobility, of course, prevailed in the colony, but the line separating the gentleman from the yeoman and the yeoman from the agricultural servant was as sharply drawn as in England. All the ceremonial terms indicating social distinctions, all the badges and insignia marking pride of blood, were in as constant use in Virginia as in England itself. Custom gave as authoritative sanction to gradations of social rank in the colony as the law gave in the mother colony. The social gulf lying between powerful and wealthy citizens like the elder William Byrd, Richard Lee, or Nicholas Spencer, and the obscure proprietor owning an adjacent estate of a few hundred acres, was as great as that dividing the English nobleman from a neighbor who occupied the same station in life as the Virginian yeoman. The exigencies of a new country were undoubtedly productive of a closer personal sympathy between the different classes in the colony than was to be observed between the different classes in England in that age. But this sympathy did not serve, to an appreciable degree, to break down the fundamental barriers dividing the different social orders, end quote. So, having acquired the material base of wealth through trade, land speculation, and the relentless cultivation of tobacco, these ambitious capitalists assumed the title of gentlemen and set about using the scant leisure time afforded them by their large estates to live up to the title. In the absence of a resident European nobility, they constructed an aristocracy of their own making, and this became the Virginia planter. Clifford Doughty, describing this in the Virginia dynasties, in describing what set them apart from the Europeans, notes, quote, "The big ones lived and worked with one fundamental difference from the typical English gentry. They were merchants and traders as well as agriculturalists. Their plantations, based upon the one money crop of tobacco, were all situated on tidal rivers, and their private wharves were shipping centers for their complicated trading operations. They shipped out tobacco and imported, along with their own needs, goods for the small settlers who paid in tobacco. They were clothiers, hardware merchants, and sometimes slave dealers. In this fashion, they combined the new commercialism of their age with traditional agriculture, on the model of the country gentlemen as men of business, on the practicalities of handling the riches of tobacco on a dangerous frontier. They emerged as a new phenomenon in world trade, the merchant planter, the Virginia planter. In their lives, the Fortune founders combined forms of the traditional society they had brought to the colony with adaptiveness to the new world as they found it. The traditionalism, not formalized or articulated, formed the framework of values, attitudes, institutions, especially in the English social hierarchy. In adapting to the geography and climate, to conditions and opportunities unique to the frontier, the emigrants neither consciously tried to preserve the traditional nor consciously introduce the new. By a day-to-day pragmatism, they evolved a new type of man. These men and women were not characterized by sensitivity. With little shading and nuance, the builders of personal empires were people of primary colors. While as individuals, they had their own apparent contradictions. They were not complex. The successful rose above the average by the higher demands they made upon themselves in exploiting their initial advantages. In these higher demands, self-discipline, the management of energy, and working through a complex of series of operations towards their large-scale aspirations, they achieved a different quality of individual, a different class of men by personal attainment. When the individuals gravitated to a center of power, they became a qualified minority, fitting the formal definition of aristocracy, end quote. Over time, about 300 families became part of this ruling gentry of Virginia planters, as Carl Breidenbaugh notes in his The Seat of Empire, saying, quote, "In the middle of the 18th century, perhaps less than 300 families were seated on plantations in Tidewater, Virginia, like the one at Nominee Hall. This group formed a parochial aristocracy, whose ranks were apparently even more difficult to enter than those of the English gentry. For over half a century, gentlemen of the best families and fortunes had been consciously coalescing into an exclusive ruling class based principally upon the possession of great tracts of land. The ranks of the gentry were further consolidated by carefully planned intermarriages among the great families, since in good 18th century fashion, family plans always took precedence over dictates of the heart." End quote. So, that is the class that formed, and out of what it formed. Cavalier in outlook and merchants by trade, they arrived with small fortunes they turned into large ones, and used those fortunes to become a gentry that was made wealthy not just by the growing of tobacco, but by trade, commercial relationships, directing labor flows, and the like, all of which connected to and was empowered by their great plantation estates. So, now moving on in this episode, We're going to explore their culture. We're going to explore how they operated, a fascinating subject that does much to shine a light on the old Virginia of the colonial period in particular, though this continued into the 19th century somewhat. We will trace how these ambitious men built a society defined by a code of personal honor and the dictates of the tobacco plant, and then we'll look at the physical and the institutional structures they used to exercise power, from the architecture of their great houses to the parish vestry and the county court, which helped them organize politically. And then we'll show their love of gambling and horse racing, their dancing, their love of music, their scholarship, and show how they synthesized the ideals of the English country gentleman with the reality of the exercise of power on the plantation and in colonial life. And then finally, we'll show how their compulsive desire to project opulent status trapped them in a generally suffocating web of transatlantic debt, which created a source of friction with British merchants that helped eventually spark the American Revolution. So I think you'll enjoy this one, and I think it will do a great deal to flesh out the Virginia Gentry for you. To understand the culture of the Virginia Gentry, one must first comprehend the cultural dominance of tobacco. This plant that John Rolfe brought to the colony, as we covered in that episode on his life, was far more than Virginia's primary export. It was the economic blood, the official currency, and even the moral index of the entire Virginian society. In a colony that suffered from a chronic and severe shortage of specie, gold and silver coin, receipts for pounds of the leaf functioned as the universal medium of exchange. Salaries of Anglican ministers, fees of county court clerks, public taxes, private debts, store purchases, all of this was calculated and settled and paid in pounds of tobacco. But further, because every gentleman was fundamentally a planter whose fortune fluctuated with the international market, tobacco became the primary measure of a man's character, intelligence, social standing. Within the competitive world of the Tidewater, the Virginia Gentry, the ultimate title of honor a planter could earn from his peers was that of a crop master. The reputation was not easily won. The cultivation of fine, sweet-scented tobacco, which commanded a premium on the market, was an exceptionally delicate and grueling 12-month art that required unremitting attention to detail. The cycle began in the cold days of midwinter when the workers cleared patches of virgin forest to sow the tiny seeds in rich ash-fertilized plant beds. In the spring, the tender seedlings had to be individually transplanted into thousands of meticulously raised hillocks of soil. Typically, the best planters waited until it rained and then frantically began this process while the rain came down, as doing so made it easier to transplant the little plants without damaging their roots. Throughout the sweltering summer months, the crop required constant, back-breaking hard labor, pinching off the top flowers to force the plant's energy into the broad leaves. This is called topping, removing the superfluous suckers, picking off destructive tobacco worms leaf by leaf under a relentless sun. When the leaf matured in late summer, the timing of the harvest was yet another high-stakes calculation for the planters. In art, it took a lifetime to learn rather than a science that could be clearly communicated. Cut too early, the leaf withered. Cut too late, a single frost could ruin the capital of an entire year. Once cut, the leaves were hung in log barns to undergo a delicate curing process. Humidity and ventilation had to be carefully managed to achieve the desired golden brown color and the rich aroma. Finally, after all that, the cured leaves were meticulously sorted by grade, they were stemmed, and they were compressed, or prized as it was called, into huge hogsheads, each of which weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. And these were then rolled down to the river landings for shipment to Great Britain. And they really focused on cramming as much tobacco into them as possible, one, because that made it last better because there's less air in there, but then also because they paid by the hogshead for shipping. So if you fit a lot more in one barrel, well, that meant you were paying a lower shipping cost than someone who only fit 600 pounds in a barrel. So all of this was delicate. It was a lengthy process. It was very difficult. And the gentleman's honor was directly bound up in the quality of the hogsheads that bore his family mark. If a planter shipped trash tobacco, leaf that was bruised, improperly cured, mixed with dirt. His reputation was instantly tarnished on not just the floors of the London and Glasgow exchanges, but in Virginia. His credit among local peers suffered a devastating blow. Conversely, producing top-tier leaf confirmed a planter's right to lead his community. So the shared year-round anxieties of the tobacco cycle, the constant watching of the clouds for rain or hail, the struggle against soil exhaustion, the negotiation of freight rates, bound these fiercely competitive planters, Virginia gentlemen, into a very tightly knit brotherhood. Because they spoke a common language that centered on the tobacco leaf and evaluated one another, not by the size of their acreage so much, but by their competence in agricultural managers, they were united as one. They were a real class that functioned well. As Breen notes in Tobacco Culture, quote, "The gentry of pre-revolutionary Virginia spent most of their waking hours thinking about crops and livestock," end quote. Somewhat different than the country gentry of England. As an example of this, George Washington near constantly wrote detailed letters about agriculture his entire life, and they didn't cease when he was on the battlefield or when he was president. As historian Joseph J. Ellis writes in his book, His Excellency George Washington, quote, "The longest letters, and more of them than he devoted to any official topic, dealt with the management of his farms at Mount Vernon. Even when immersed in crucial diplomatic negotiations with France or controversial deliberations about Hamilton's fiscal policy, Washington found time to compose meticulous instructions to his managers about plowing, weeding, worming, or grubbing schedules," end quote. If tobacco provided the economic engine and measurement standard of the gentry, the Great House provided its physical, visual manifestation. And make no mistake, the two were bound together, for the house and tobacco together displayed the wealth and autonomy of a successful planter, and thus showed their good management and economic security and economic independence, which is important to hegemonic liberty, as we'll get into towards the end of this episode, which raised their estimation, in the eyes of their fellows, much as a good crop did. As Breen notes in Tobacco Culture, quote, "Without substantial property, a planter's claim to personal autonomy obviously rang hollow. Perhaps if the colony had developed a genuine titled aristocracy, a social system in which birth to a certain family automatically conferred noble status, the great planters might have been less concerned about visible material success. But though the sons of Virginia gentlemen usually became gentlemen, there's no guarantee that every male bearing a particular surname would achieve economic or political eminence. This insecurity, which seems to have grown more pronounced on the eve of the Revolution, created curious tensions within gentry culture. Maintenance of the external trappings of independence, big houses, fast horses, jumpsters finery, the like, forced the great planters to monitor the flow of pounds and pence more closely than they would have liked. Poor management threatened a man's independence," end quote. This was a trend that developed in the so-called Golden Age of Virginia, the first half of the 18th century, when tobacco prices were generally high and the colony generally at peace. Beforehand, the houses they built, the manner in which they lived wasn't so grand. But then as the Golden Age began and they began to have more wealth to spend on the big houses that Breen mentions, along with all the attendant trappings, they started to spend it. But it's important to recognize that that was a change. In the early decades of the 17th century, and really even into the end of the 17th century, even the wealthiest Virginia planters lived in relatively modest, temporary, timber-framed structures. Describing this, Burton J. Hendrick in The Lees of Virginia notes, quote, "In Richard's time, the Cavaliers are supposed to have given character to Virginia life. That first primeval Lee estate, however, disclosed few evidences of a baronial existence. Those fine country houses were to appear in another century, but none had been built in Richard's time. Indeed, in the entire 17th century, there's probably not one Virginia mansion that rose above the commonplace. Richard Lee's house, if it resembled the prevailing habitation of his class, was a barn-like, unpainted structure of wood, 1.5 stories high, with gabled roof and enormous outside brick chimneys at both ends, almost as wide as the house itself," end quote. But as the gentry consolidated their fortunes and solidified their social dominance in the 18th century, they embarked on a massive, competitive building boom, constructing magnificent brick and stone mansions across the Tidewater landscape. Dwellings like Thomas Lee's Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, William Byrd II's Westover along the James River, Landon Carter's Sabine Hall, and John Taylor's Mount Airy were designed not just as comfortable family residences, but as formidable architectural statements of class authority, power, solidity, and wealth. T.H. Breen, describing this in Tobacco Culture, notes, quote, "It was not until the 1720s and 1730s that elegant Georgian structures such as Westover, Sabine Hall, and Mount Airy began to appear along Virginia's major rivers. The construction of these mansions revealed changes that were reshaping the colony's social structure. Though it seems a truism to state that the rich were getting richer, the poor poorer, that is exactly what was occurring in early 18th century Virginia. The sources of these growing social distinctions were obvious. The wealthier planters, those with a little cash to invest or with access to credit, purchased slaves. In fact, it was during this period that the colony's labor force became predominantly black. The small planters simply could not afford to purchase slaves, and since the colonists who owned blacks produced more tobacco, they inevitably found themselves in a position to buy additional Africans. The process continued until some planters, like the Carters, literally possessed hundreds of unfree workers." End quote. The architecture of the Great House was thoroughly grounded in the formal, classical principles of the Georgian and Palladian styles, which emphasized symmetry, order, and proportion. The buildings were deliberately designed to project a sense of permanence, restraint, and immovable authority over the surrounding landscape, as suited a somewhat republican already society that was also aristocratic. Typically set upon an elevated rise overlooking one of Virginia's broad navigable rivers, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York, or the James, the manor house commanded the horizon, serving as an inescapable visual reminder of the master's dominance and taste to everyone who approached by land or water. Further, in their beauty and imitation of the then popular Georgian style, they staked the Virginia Gentry's claim on the idea that it was just as much a landed elite as the British gentry and aristocracy it sought to emulate, shown by the architectural emulation. Even more importantly, the layout of the plantation complex operated as yet another diagram or method of showing the gentry's social order. The main house sat at the center of the composition. It represented the supreme head of the estate. Flanking it in general symmetry were lower subordinate dependency buildings: the kitchen, the laundry, the estate office, the coach house, the stables. Further removed from this central axis lay the overseer's house, the tobacco barns, and the rude log quarters of the workforce. Rhys Isaac, noting the symbolism of this design of the homes and their organization in his The Transformation of Virginia, 1740 to 1790, notes, quote, "Members of the Virginia gentry like to think of their estates as rural retreats from a world of unworthy striving, where, as one declared in a biblical phrase echoed by many others, we sit securely under our vines and our fig trees." They identified their country seats with Roman villas, such as Horace's Sabine Farm, from which Colonel Landon Carter took the name of his newly built country seat, Sabine Hall. This imagery served to intensify the ideal of the Great House, with its symmetrically retained dependencies, as a self-sufficient rural community. Rule over slave-supported plantations encouraged in the Virginia gentry a deep response to the symbolism of rank that the three-part structures so strongly expressed. End quote. This physical arrangement organized space in a strict descending hierarchy. A visitor approached the estate, passing through a carefully controlled sequence of thresholds. Arriving at the river landing, one moved up a broad, manicured lawn or through a formal geometric garden toward the imposing front facade of the Great House. And that was organized where it went along the river, because most traveled by boat during this period, because that was so much faster, more comfortable, and easier than traveling over the notoriously terrible Virginia roads. And the nature of Chesapeake society meant that just going up and down the rivers was a very easy thing to do. That's why all these great mansion houses are built alongside rivers. In any case, inside, the interior space was similarly partitioned to separate the public realm of a gentlemanly reception from the private family quarters and the service areas utilized by domestic servants. The thick brick walls, deep window casings, and elevated stone steps were engineered to elevate the master above the common level, reinforcing the jurisdiction he had over his family, his tenantry, his laborers. Yet further, the design of all these arrangements served as a reminder both to the master and the visitor that, enjoyable and dignified as such a life might be, it was not carefree. It required meticulous management of all involved. As Charles S. Sidner notes in his American Revolutionaries in the Making, quote, "In time, the sons of planters became planters themselves and learned their first lessons in administration by managing their own farms or plantations. In some instances, the establishment was small, but today, a visitor today to Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Gunston Hall, and Monticello, or Carter's Grove and Shirley of the Carters, Westover of the Birds, Stratford of the Lees, Brandon of the Harrisons, Bremo of the Cokes, Berry Hill of the Bruces, or the homes of other leading families of 18th and early 19th centuries, leaves no doubt that many of these men were masters of large estates. Their broad acres and ample houses set the stage for independent and dignified living, but their lives were not carefree. The management of the economic, social, and political microcosm that was theirs was a heavy, multifarious responsibility. Plans had to be made and executed for maintaining buildings, for allocating fields to the various crops, so on." End quote. Overall, the Great House was a way of reminding visitors what the high-quality leaf of its owner created, which was a supremacy over the colony that was as visible and as real in the political sense as in the architecture they built. A defining characteristic of colonial Virginia related to this was its almost complete lack of genuine urban centers. Unlike New England, which developed a dense network of compact agricultural villages centered on town meeting houses, or the Middle Colonies, which featured bustling commercial seaports like Philadelphia and New York, Virginia remained an overwhelmingly decentralized rural society. The geography of the Tidewater, crisscrossed as it was by 4 massive deep-water rivers and hundreds of navigable creeks that together meant there were thousands of miles of coastline that could be navigated by mercantile vessels or personal vessels, as we mentioned, allowed the great planters to construct private wharves directly on their own riverfront estates. Ships from London, Bristol, Glasgow sailed straight to the planter's doorstep to unload manufactured goods, typically from England, and load hogsheads of tobacco, both for the planters and for local yeomen, eliminating the economic necessity of some sort of central port city. Instead of that sort of city, the great houses were complexes that were themselves often turned into effective port cities that served all the same functions, but in a unique way for the Chesapeake world that further enriched and aggrandized the Virginia Gentry. This is noted by Harlow Giles Unger in his book First Founding Father, which is about Richard Henry Lee, and he describes it in the context of Stratford Hall, the seat of the Lee family. Quote, "Below, on river's edge beneath Stratford Hall, stood a mill, a warehouse, a landing for ocean-going transports, a ship's store, and a fully equipped shipyard to build, repair, and service ships. Scattered about the property was housing for as many as 100 slaves, servants, and workers, including weavers, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, shipwrights, millers, herdsmen, weavers, tailors, shoemakers, and other craftsmen. In effect, Thomas Lee had transformed a corner of Virginia into a thriving, self-sufficient English waterfront community," end quote. And his eldest son, Philip Lee, eventually developed that even further, turning it into a really bustling tobacco shipping facility at one point. In this decentralized agrarian world, the gentry did not govern through municipal bureaucracies or town meetings. Instead, as could be expected given the great houses, they maintained political and social control over the colony and led it well, doing so with duty at the foremost of their minds through a self-reinforcing tripod of local institutions, the Plantation, the Parish Vestry, and the County Court. Together, these 3 bodies served as the primary nurseries of statesmanship, providing young Virginia gentlemen with a continuous hands-on apprenticeship in the art of governing men, long before they ever stepped into the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg or the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and leading to the Virginia Gentry producing a crop of particularly and consistently high-quality political leaders. The first leg of this institutional tripod was the individual plantation itself. The Great House was not just a farm, it was a self-contained economic and legal principality. In absolute rule of his estate, the planter exercised direct, administrative, and judicial authority over family members, indentured servants, overseers, artisans, and, of course, slaves. Day after day, the planter was required to manage the complex agricultural operations of the estate, enforce labor discipline, allocate provisions amongst everyone, settle internal disputes amongst the various workers or family members, and maintain detailed ledgers tracking his profits, investments, expenses, so on. If he failed to consistently lead this extremely complex operation well and prudently, he would go broke and lose it all after falling into ruinous levels of debt that destroyed his public character. This even happened to William Byrd III, who began life, as the wealthiest man in the colony by a wide degree and died broke and disgraced. He didn't pay attention to his huge estate, and so it left his hands. This daily exercise of unchecked domestic command bred in the Virginia Gentry a natural and unquestioned habit of authority, what contemporaries described as the Virginia habit of command. As Karl Breidenbach notes in his book, The Seat of Empire, quote, "Nowhere did the 18th century provide a more thorough schooling in the management of practical affairs and in the handling of people than on these tidewater plantations where young Virginians were reared. Early did they develop an awareness of their privileged status. Early did they acquire the habit of command." End quote. Describing this in his American Revolutionaries in the Making and connecting it to the particular brand of intensely conservative and competent politics that defined Virginia even in its revolutionary period, and showing how that's connected to the plantations these gentlemen, these Virginia gentry had to run, Charles Sydnor notes, quote, "Records had to be kept and letters written in longhand in rooms without screed windows to keep out flies, mosquitoes, and moths. The planter knew the feel of plowed land underfoot, the smell of manure, the heat of the sun, the bite of cold wind, the heavy breathing of an overworked horse, the holiday spirit of the quarters, the sullen scowl of an angry slave. He learned to accommodate his plantation management to the inexplorable laws of nature and his dealings with people to real men and women. Perhaps from these experiences he gained wisdom for public life. At any rate, in politics, the Virginia planter seemed to understand that, although ideals and ultimate goals were worth striving for, legislation and political policy had to be fitted to Virginia and Virginians as they existed in the 18th century, to the nation as it was in 1789." End quote. He adds, continuing a little bit later in the book, quote, "The planter, of course, could indulge in theories and speculations to his heart's content, and often did. He could experiment with unorthodox crops, methods of marketing, or ways of controlling human beings. But if his penchant for experimentation was too great, or his judgment too frequently wrong, the error of his ways was made plainly and painfully obvious to him and to his neighbors, for the planter's business operations were carried on in public. Untidy fields, scrawny livestock, and dilapidated house gave notice through the countryside that the owner lacked energy, judgment, or some other quality essential to good management. A man who could not manage well his own affairs would hardly impress his neighbors as a man who ought to be entrusted with the management of public affairs. In 18th century Virginia, failure in business was seldom rewarded with a seat in the county court or in the legislature or with such offices as sheriff, clerk, or coroner." End quote. Remember how I mentioned earlier the importance of tobacco, the overwhelming importance of tobacco. It was a visible manifestation of a man's quality, and the growing of it well at immense scale served consistently as a way not just of training him in the habit of command, but of showing off his talents, his skills, his moral qualities to his neighbors. That wasn't all. The growing of tobacco also nurtured in these Virginians a peculiar spirit beyond the habit of command, a unique blend of competence and love of liberty that informed their political decision-making and devotion to public duty. Philip Alexander Bruce, describing this in his Economic History of Virginia in the 17th Century, Volume 2, notes, quote, "The moral influence of the large plantation was equally extraordinary. It fostered habits of self-reliance in individual men. It assisted in promoting an intense love of liberty. It strengthened the ties of family and kinship at the very time that it cultivated the spirit of general hospitality. Descended from the race of Englishmen, indeed, in many instances born under English skies themselves, the Virginians of the 17th century led a life, in consequence of the independent and manly existence permitted by the plantation system, that confirmed all the great qualities which had formed a part of their moral inheritance as scions of English stock. It was a life that allowed the individuality of each planter to expand without obstacle. It is not surprising that in a great crisis like the American Revolution, when sufficient time had passed for Virginia to produce a population racy of her own soil, molded by her own material conditions, there should have sprung up a body of men of exalted merit in those departments of human affairs in which her general system was most calculated to develop talent, the sphere of military action, the sphere of statesmanship. The large plantations, by giving birth to a class of great landowners, increased the importance of leaders in the community, promoted the aristocratic spirit, not the less strongly because there were no legally defined ranks in society. It created a rural gentry as proud as that of England. End quote. So, moving on from the plantation, the second leg of the tripod was the Anglican Parish Vestry. The Church of England was the officially established state church in colonial Virginia, but unlike its parent body in Great Britain, the colonial church was dominated by the local lay gentry. Because there was no resident Anglican bishop in North America to oversee ecclesiastical affairs, the governance of the parish fell entirely into the hands of the local vestry. The vestry was a powerful, self-perpetuating board composed of 12 of the most prominent, wealthy gentlemen in the parish. When a vacancy occurred through death or resignation, the remaining 11 members chose the replacement, ensuring that power remained locked within this tight circle of gentry families and that they were the ones who had the opportunity to learn how to rule, to learn how to govern, learn how to command. The parish vestry possessed extensive statutory powers, actually, and they touched every level of local society. They levied the annual parish tithes, a mandatory tax assessed on all inhabitants, regardless of their personal religious beliefs, to pay for the established church. They built and maintained the local churches, purchased lands for the minister, and paid the parson's annual salary and tobacco. All of that was handled by the vestry council. Furthermore, the vestry functioned as the primary social welfare agency of the colony. They administered poor relief, cared for orphans, cared for illegitimate children, also cared for the indigent sick, binding out destitute youths as apprentices to local farmers. In addition to that, they were charged with supervising the moral order of the community, presenting individuals to the county court for offenses such as Sabbath breaking, drunkenness, swearing, and adultery. Further, every 5 years, the vestry organized the process of processioning. This was a formal ritual walk along the boundary lines of each private land tract in the parish, and it confirmed property marks and prevented land disputes. Through the vestry, young gentlemen learned how to manage public finances, administer social relief, enforce community norms, enforce the law. It was important training. And Carl Breidenbach, describing this in his The Seat of Empire, showing how it related to their political leadership and training, says, quote, "To the planter, fresh from unchallenged authority over his own little patriarchal domain, the occasional meetings of the vestry served as the vital second step of his political training. Here he sat with 11 other planters who were his equals and determined what was best for the middling and inferior folk of the parish. Membership in vestries had become virtually hereditary by 1750, and collectively the vestrymen made up a sort of panel from which Virginia's rulers were drawn. Government was their business quite as much as the raising of tobacco because their birth, place, wealth, education, practical training, and frequently intelligence fitted them to rule." End quote. This was political training at its grittiest. They had to jump into unpaid political service to the community, doing so out of duty, that accompanies landed privilege because it is what one ought do. And this is the spirit that motivated great Virginians like Richard Henry Lee and George Washington beyond just the desire to excel. They were raised in a milieu that cared about and thought frequently of duty, and they did their best to act on that. It dominated their lives and is something of which they spoke constantly. So then, after the vestry, the third leg of the institutional tripod that supported their rule at the local level was the county court. Colonial Virginia was divided into administrative counties, each governed by a court composed of local justices of the peace, all of whom were members of the Virginia Gentry, and used the position as further political training. While the justices were nominally appointed by the royal governor in Williamsburg, the governor virtually always selected new justices from a list of nominees submitted directly by the existing members of the bench. The county bench was also composed exclusively of the leading planters of the district, and who served without any financial salary, viewing the office as a mandatory civic duty and a badge of gentlemanly status. The jurisdiction of the county court was, like with the vestry board, immense. It combined executive, legislative, and judicial functions into a single body. Meeting monthly at the county courthouse, the justices adjudicated all civil litigation from land boundary suits and debt collections to estate settlements. They tried all criminal cases that didn't involve capital punishment. Those were handled in Williamsburg. They sentenced petty offenders to the stocks, so on. On the administrative side, the county court managed the infrastructure of the region. They authorized the clearing of public roads, ordered the construction of bridges and ferries, licensed local taverns and set their prices, fixed the county tax rate, supervised the collection of public levies. They had a wide array of things they had to deal with, all of it, again, unpaid. Describing the role in political training this served for the Virginia Gentry in his American Revolutionaries in the Making, Sidner notes, quote, having passed the first testing point on the political pathway by securing the approval of the local gentry, and as a side note, he there means their service on the Vestry Council, which had happened before they could start serving as justices of the peace, the young justice began his practical education in the School of Government as a member of the county court. Here, the curriculum was broad, embracing civil and criminal cases, administrative problems, the fixing of local tax rates, the election of county officials. The novice was not secluded in a private office with reference books about him, but like an apprentice, he was seated with several of his older, more experienced colleagues while transacting the daily routine of public business. Thus, youth learned from age, and age informed an opinion of the diligence and ability of the new member of the court. On the basis of this opinion, the older members of the court could retard or accelerate the political advancement of the younger justices. The work of the county court kept the justices in close touch with life. They saw the effect of general policies set by the court and by Williamsburg on the lives of individual men and women. Before them came the rich man seeking to evade listing his carriage for taxation, the tavern keeper charged with abusing an apprenticed orphan, the slave indicted with poisoning his fellow slave, the farmer complaining about poor roads. Nearly all of the Virginians who helped establish the rules under which the Commonwealth of Virginia should operate, and who had a large share in setting the federal system upon its course, had seen the faces of men and women, children and old people, freeholders and slaves, when the power of government was applied to their individual lives. In 18th century Virginia, men learned to administer law and observe the effects of law before they were entrusted with its making. End quote. Furthermore, the county court was the central arena for local political life. It was on court day, a monthly gathering that drew freeholders, small farmers, peddlers, and laborers from across the county, that elections for the House of Burgesses were formally conducted. Voting was executed publicly and orally. Each freeholder stepped forward before the assembled crowd, stood beneath the raised bench of the justices, and cast his vote aloud in the presence of the candidates. When a small farmer voted for a gentleman planter, the candidate would rise, tip his hat, and publicly thank the voter. This open-air electoral ritual allowed the common voters a feeling of participation and real hand in participation. These elections were somewhat small because they were at the county level and only involved freeholders, while visibly confirming the social supremacy of the gentry candidates. Within this framework, religion in colonial Virginia served less as an instrument of intense individual theological introspection, as was the case in the Northeast, particularly in New England, than as a vital mechanism for preserving social order and hierarchy. The Anglicanism of the Virginia gentry was characterized by intense aversion to religious enthusiasm, emotionalism, or fanaticism, viewing religion primarily through the lens of civic virtue, moral discipline, and social cohesion. As one Virginian humorously put it, quote, "We go to church to thank the Almighty we are Virginians and to see which of our friends we would like to invite home for dinner," end quote. Such is how it went. The Sunday service at the parish church was a formalized, ritualized theater of social rank. The physical structure of the church building itself reflected the stratified nature of Chesapeake society, particularly in Tidewater and Northern Neck, Virginia. The interior was divided into high-backed wooden pews. The most prestigious pews, located up at the front, adjacent to the pulpit, the altar, or in elevated galleries were reserved for the great gentry families, who often adorned their seats with velvet cushions, family coat of arms. The common freeholders and small farmers occupied simpler pews in the rear of the nave, while indentured servants, landless laborers, and enslaved workers stood near the entry doors or sat in remote, unadorned galleries, kind of depending. The arrival of the local gentry at the church, and when out in the country, the gentry did regularly attend church so as to set an example of good behavior, was a carefully choreographed ritual of class deference. The common families arrived early, gathering in the churchyard under the shade of the trees, and there they traded gossip, discussed crop prospects, and compared horses. The gentry participated in that too, but only after arriving, and doing so, they delayed their arrival. Shortly before the service was scheduled to commence, the grand carriages of the Virginia Gentry, generally imported from London and drawn by 4 or 6 matched, blooded horses with uniformed coachmen and livery, rolled up the gravel driveway. The small farmers cleared a respectful path as the master and his family stepped out, clad in the latest European fashions of silk, velvet, powdered wigs, all of that. The congregation waited outside until the great gentlemen, their ladies, had walked up the aisle and taken their seats in the front pews. Only then did the commons file in behind them to fill the remaining space. Through this weekly visual drama, the divine authority of the church was fused, almost explicitly, with the authority of the planter class over earthly matters, reinforcing the concept of the social hierarchy in Virginia and connecting it to the natural, God-ordained structure of the universe. Naturally, the Virginia gentry fought hard to keep out such influences as Quakerism, Puritanism, Methodism, and Baptistry, viewing all of these as threats to the social hierarchy that the established church was meant to support. Once inside the church and listening to the sermons while participating in the ceremony, religious life in colonial Virginia was ceremonial, liturgical, hierarchical, and ritualistic. It was a pragmatic form of Protestantism that generally emphasized social conformity over religious piety. And unlike in New England, Virginians did not often search their souls or wage war over religious differences, at least once the Puritans and Quakers had been chased out and before baptistry arrived in the years preceding the Revolution. To the gentry of Old Virginia, religion was not the chief end of life, but rather an important component of being a country gentleman in the English manner. That said, they believed it. They were faithful Christians and thought it was important, and attending church was an important thing. They just weren't filled with the sort of zeal and fanaticism that one found with the Puritans or the Quakers. Rhys Isaac, noting this in his The Transformation of Virginia, quotes a letter in which Virginians writing home to England about the need for a new parson said, describing the ideal man, quote, "And as in words and actions, they should be neither too reserved nor too extravagant. So in principles should they be neither too high nor too low. The Virginians being neither favorers of popery nor presbytery, they must be such as can converse and know more than bare philosophy and speculative ethics, and to have studied men and business as well as books. They may be facetious and good-humored without too much freedom and licentiousness." End quote. Isaac, joking about this, says, quote, "Wanted, a parson who can carry his religion as he should his liquor, like a gentleman," end quote. That does about sum it up and sum up how they viewed religion. While the Virginia gentleman was a hardworking agricultural manager and an active local magistrate, his social identity was equally defined by his participation in a rich, highly visible culture of leisure, hospitality, and intellectual refinement. The gentry operated within a world that placed an extraordinarily high value on physical courage, grace, generosity, and open-handed display. Leisure activities weren't just idle diversions. They were crucial public arenas where a gentleman demonstrated his fitness to rule. So, to set the scene, describing this grand culture of hospitality and enjoyment of life in her book, Colonial Virginians at Play, Jane Carson notes, quote, "By the middle of the 18th century, wealthy tidewater planters were entertaining so eagerly and so lavishly that guests were sometimes overwhelmed and decided that their hosts, and Virginians in general, were idle and vain, ostentatious and pleasure-loving. The extravagance of their welcome and of the plantation itself was easily misinterpreted. Englishmen who were accustomed to the relatively small estates of the gentry at home did not always understand that land was plentiful in America, and a prosperous colonial planter had to have large holdings in order to provide the new fields demanded by tobacco culture. Family units were isolated by the long distances between plantation houses, and visitors were greatly valued as a relief to the loneliness and monotony of daily social life. Servants were numerous, if not always efficient. Food was abundant and varied, and entertaining was informal and easy. Travelers who stayed long enough to feel at home appreciated the spontaneity and sincerity of their welcome and understood the fact that their hosts were normally busy people who were themselves enjoying a vacation in the company of their guests. End quote. At the center of gentry leisure and gentry life in general really stood an obsession with horses and equestrian sports. To a tidewater planter or northern neck planter, a fine horse was the ultimate status symbol, a living embodiment of beauty, power, aristocratic heritage. So the Virginia Gentry, spent vast fortunes importing thoroughbred stallions and mares from the finest breeding stables in England, meticulously tracking their bloodlines in private stud books. A gentleman was expected to be a flawless horseman from early childhood, capable of managing the most spirited charger with calm, effortless control. That said, the Virginia breed of horses that gradually developed was known for being an easy riding breed. This love of riding took on an absurdity to some outside observers, one of whom, a man named Hugh Jones, noted, quote, "There are such lovers of riding that almost every ordinary person keeps a horse, and I've known some spend the morning ranging several miles in the woods to find and catch their horses, only to ride 2 or 3 miles to church, to the courthouse, or to a horse race, where they generally appoint to meet upon business, and are more certain of finding those that they want to speak to or deal with than at their home." End quote. So they would do anything to be seen riding and to ride because they enjoyed it. Out of this love of horsemanship came a fixation with fox hunting. Hunting generally was beloved, particularly bird hunting, but also fox hunting because it could be done on horseback, and then racing. This equestrian passion was really, it found its highest public expression in the high-stakes sport of quarter racing. Unlike the long oval circuit races of modern equestrian sport, at Colonial, Virginia, quarter racing consisted of 2 horses sprinting at breakneck speed down a straight quarter-mile dirt track cleared through the forest or along a country road. These events drew huge and very rowdy crowds from every stratum of society, but the track itself was an exclusive preserve of gentry dominance. By law and custom, participation as an owner or rider in a formal race was restricted strictly to gentlemen. On one famous occasion in 17th century York County, a local tailor named James Bullock was formally prosecuted and fined by the county court for the crime of entering his own horse in a race, the court sternly declaring that the horse racing was, quote, "a sport reserved exclusively for gentlemen," end quote. Quarter racing, along with card playing and similar diversions, provided an arena for what some historians of colonial Virginia have called deep play, which was high stakes gambling, and so high stakes, in fact, that the sums risked were extraordinary and presented a serious threat to the bettor's material fortune. It was far from uncommon for a Virginia planter to wager hundreds of pounds sterling, which at the time was quite a lot, multiple hogsheads of tobacco, or even valuable tracts of land on the outcome of a single quarter-mile sprint or a battle between 2 gamecocks. To some extent, compulsive, high-stakes gambling was just financial recklessness as planters blew off steam. But it also served a more important cultural purpose. It was a psychological ritual in which the gentry showed its self-control and stoicism. By risking vast sums with unruffled composure, a gentleman could demonstrate that he was a man of steady and unyielding nerve. Win or lose, the planter was expected to accept the outcome with a cool, stoic equanimity, proving that his personal honor and self-control were superior to the whims of financial fortune. In a society where economic survival was constantly threatened by the unpredictability of weather, crop disease, international market swings, all of that, deep play allowed the planter class to symbolically confront and master chance itself in a public display of dominance. Still, some took it too far, many took it too far, and saw their whole fortunes drained by deep play, most infamously William Byrd III. For this reason, many of the more serious planters disliked it and only ever risked trivial sums. George Washington, for example, would only ever expend a few shillings at a time on horse races or cards. He had a small part of his budget set aside for it and would never risk his fortune on cards or anything like that. Parallel to this attachment, to competitive outdoor sports culture was an equally intense commitment to lavish, open-handed hospitality. Because the great river estates were isolated from one another by miles of forest and marshland, the gentry suffered from a chronic and deep-seated hunger for social interaction. To relieve this isolation, the planter converted his great house into a essentially permanently open inn for traveling members of the gentry, friends, respectable strangers. A visitor arriving at a gentry mansion, whether unannounced or invited, was welcomed with warm and effusive generosity. Grooms took charge of the horses, while the host provided comfortable lodgings, fine dinners of roasted game, oysters, and meats, endless flow of Madeira wine, claret, rum punch. House parties at the great manors frequently extended for days and occasionally weeks as neighbors gathered from across the peninsula to socialize, conduct business, engage in romance. The centerpiece of these gatherings was the evening dance. In colonial Virginia, dancing was not regarded as just some superficial thing. It was a fundamental, really highly disciplined social requirement. For this reason, members of the gentry engaged professional itinerant dancing masters, most famously a guy named Mr. Christian, who traveled on a regular circuit from plantation to plantation and spent several days at each estate to instruct the young boys and girls in the complex and courtly dance and choreography of the era. Under the strict eye of the dancing master, gentry children were drilled for hours in posture, deportment, the formal bow and curtsy, the intricate footwork of the French minuet, and the lively, more kinetic English country dances. When the violins played at a plantation ball, the young men and women stepped onto the polished floor and executed movements that required physical coordination, grace, and poise, all while being watched very critically often by their assembled elders. So if a young man stumbled, lacked grace, was awkward, nervous, he was marked as unrefined, and that damaged his social standing and his matrimonial prospects, which, because of the way dowry worked, could significantly damage his financial prospects as well. This is why George Washington, for example, mastered dance. It was a physical art, and it showed self-command. This made it a visible visual performance and demonstrated that the planter class possessed the refined discipline necessary to govern themselves and their society. Everything was ritualized and symbolic here. This related to related interactions as well. For example, in this cavalier society, as noted by Carson and Colonial Virginians at play, flirtation, whether polite formality or serious pursuit, was an important part of social exchange. Further, Carson notes, accompanying all this was music, both for dance and just for its own sake. She says, quote, the second ornament was closely allied to the first, for the music so necessary to dancing was usually provided by members of the family, and of course it was an art cultivated for its own sake. A German officer who visited Monticello during the Revolutionary War later observed that all Virginians are fond of music. All the daughters of the gentry, some of the sons, received some kind of formal training. Music teachers, like dancing masters, traveled about from plantation to plantation. Sometimes the same person taught both dancing and music. End quote. But it needs to be emphasized, the Virginia gentry was not just a class of horsemen and reckless gamblers who liked dancing. Despite their love of all of that, from outdoor action and physical display to conviviality, the leading men of this society were not unlettered rustics. On the contrary, the 18th century elite of Virginia cultivated a deep, serious, broad-minded intellectual life, amassing impressive public libraries that were among the largest and most sophisticated on the North American continent. William Byrd II of Westover, for example, one of the most important, wealthiest, and successful men of his day, assembled an extraordinary library of over 4,000 volumes covering history, law, medicine, theology, science, and classical literature. They were in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, all of which he could read in. Robert Carter of Nominee Hall maintained a library of about 500 meticulously selected volumes. The Lee family at Stratford Hall and Mount Pleasant possessed vast collections of classical and contemporary texts. Importantly, these weren't ornamental collections designed just for display. as can be seen in the marginal notes of them, the private diaries of those who owned them, and just commonplace books left behind by men like Richard Lee II, Landon Carter, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson. All of that reveals that these planters did read their books with a great degree of engagement, using them to learn about everything from political theory, the art of good rule, to religion, to scientific agriculture. Their intellectual world was thoroughly grounded in the ideal of the well-rounded, public-minded gentleman, the synthesis of the scholar, the soldier, the magistrate, and the cultivator. They were influenced in particular by Stoic philosophers like Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, and through them learned that happiness was found in self-mastery, emotional restraint, and dedication to public duty. They immersed themselves in the great Roman historians, Livy, Tacitus, and Sallust, drawing urgent lessons regarding the fragility of free republics and the mortal danger of political corruption, luxury, and executive tyranny. When the conflict with Great Britain emerged in the 1760s, these Virginia planters were intellectual vanguards, intimately familiar with the legal principles of the English common law, the constitutional history of the 17th century, and the political philosophy of men like John Locke or the Whig pamphleteers who created this country ideology that was very resistant to corruption in the courts of kings. Their deep reading provided them with the tools and the vocabulary required to analyze imperial policy and then fight against it politically while constructing a new constitutional order. So they were scholars, but also very masculine, very action-oriented. And this was a unique intellectual generation that was forged in the quiet libraries of their great houses. Then there was the matter of liberty and how they viewed it. It's a common question. How could men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, and George Mason denounce British taxation as an attempt to reduce them to a state of absolute slavery, given the workforces on which they relied? The answer lies in their particular conception of liberty, hegemonic liberty. To the 18th century Virginia gentleman, and also really the 17th century or 19th century Virginia gentleman, liberty was not understood as some innate universal human right that belonged equally to all human beings by virtue of their existence. Rather, liberty was understood as a privilege. It was a tangible earned estate of rank, status, property, and behavior that granted a master the absolute right to govern himself and his dependencies without any arbitrary outside interference. To be a free gentleman was to possess total self-sovereignty, demanding, for one, a rigorous dominion over self, but also to be supported in that by the ownership of land and labor, which provided the material independence necessary to exercise unclouded, virtuous political judgment. The daily presence of chattel slavery on their plantations intensified the gentry's obsession with their own personal liberty. Living surrounded by hundreds of slaves, the planter had a constant visual lesson in what happened to those who lost their independence. Any attempt by an external authority, whether the British Parliament, a royal governor, or distant merchant, to infringe upon the planter's private property rights, levy taxes without his consent, or dictate his internal affairs was viewed not as just unfair policy, but as really an existential assault upon the class, because to yield to arbitrary authority was to step onto the path that led to dependency and submission, to be reduced, in their own words, to the status of slaves. The preservation of their mastery over their own households and colony was non-negotiable to their identity, particularly their political identity, but also their social identity. So this fierce sense of independence was subjected to severe strain by the mid-18th century, not just politically, but also the economic realities of the transatlantic tobacco trade led to this. In their commercial dealings with Great Britain, the Virginia planters attempted to impose their own gentlemanly code of honor onto the cold and impersonal mechanics of international capitalism. Because the planters lived thousands of miles across the ocean from their markets, they didn't sell their tobacco through open auction houses and instead relied on the consignment system, generally. Under the consignment system, a Virginia planter shipped his hogsheads of tobacco directly to a specific consignment merchant or factor in London, Bristol, or Glasgow. The merchant received the leaf, paid the heavy British customs duties, sold the crop on the English or European market for the best price obtainable, and placed the net proceeds to the planter's private account. Simultaneously, the merchant acted as the planter's personal purchasing agent in Great Britain. The planter sent detailed invoices or shopping lists to his factor, ordering every good that can be imagined, from tools to luxury items like mahogany furniture, silver tea services, coaches, horses, silk dresses, tailored suits, books, wine. They ordered a lot of wine, stuff like that. The merchant purchased these items in London, loaded them onto merchant vessels, and shipped them back to the planter's private river wharf, debiting the cost against the planter's tobacco balance. To the planter, this was part of just the gentry life. It was part of being a Virginia gentleman. It wasn't a simple or arm's length business contract. It was a commercial friendship, a bond founded on mutual honor, trust, reciprocal favors, and class equality. The planter expected his merchant to protect his reputation, secure the best price possible for his tobacco, purchase imported goods of the highest quality at the lowest cost, and display generous patience if a bad harvest caused a temporary deficit in his account or low prices did the same. In return, the planter pledged his exclusive loyalty, promising to ship his entire annual crop to that merchant house year after year. This broke down by the middle decades of the 18th century as there were economic shifts. For one, the Virginia gentry grew much more opulent during this period, and so even though the price of tobacco was basically fine, they found themselves deeper and deeper in debt. They were just going along with too much luxury. In fact, they were engaging in a competitive spree of luxury consumption, ordering lavish goods from London and building finer and finer mansions because they wanted to display their wealth. Simultaneously, the international tobacco market went through a period of extreme volatility involving price crashes, rising freight and insurance costs due to near constant war, tightening credit markets in Europe. And this created a financial trap for the planters. Year after year, the cost of the imported luxury goods ordered by the planters far outstripped the net returns on their tobacco sales. To cover these chronic deficits, the British merchant houses extended large lines of credit, allowing the planters to run up massive debts that just rolled over year after year, charging them interest and accumulating rapidly. Also, the factors were charging high interest rates, and they had a monopoly over the planters' future tobacco crops, which created a power dependence. So it was a bad situation. It got worse in the 1760s and early 1770s because the series of financial panics in London and Amsterdam forced British credit markets to contract violently. Facing bankruptcy themselves, British merchant firms abruptly abandoned the etiquette of debt and the fiction of commercial friendship, and instead fired off harsh and urgent letters across the Atlantic demanding immediate repayment of outstanding balances, forcing payment of the exorbitant interest rates, and sometimes requiring planters to mortgage their property and their laborers to pay off the debts while threatening suits in Virginia courts to attach property to the debts. It was not a good situation. And these aggressive demands against Virginia gentlemen who were very proud were an intolerable shock. In the culture of the Tidewater gentry, a gentleman's honor was inseparable from his financial independence and his credit. To be deeply in debt was to be in a state of dependency, the very state they associated with poverty and degradation and slavery, and were still being attacked by a distant merchant and treated as an unreliable debtor, threatening the loss of one's ancestral land. It was a mortal insult to gentlemanly honor, and the planters felt betrayed as a result. They convinced themselves that it wasn't their extravagant spending that was at fault, but that the British merchants were not acting out of necessity and were instead engaged in a predatory plot that was very deliberate. They thought the factors had systematically manipulated freight charges, artificially depressed tobacco prices, inflated the cost of imported goods, lured the planters into a golden snare of credit to strip them of their independence, seize their land, and reduce them to vassals of the metropolis. But that didn't happen to all planters. Notably, the families that remained true to their origins, which was sharp merchants with an eye for profit, were able to avoid this pretty easily. Some did so through prudence in their dealings, always limiting their shopping lists to remain out of debt and diversifying crops while investing in manufacturing or other operations. George Washington and Robert Carter of Nominee Hall are two of the most famous and prominent examples. Almost always out of debt and growing their wealth rather than spending it down, they showed how a planter could maintain his place even in a changing world through prudence. Others did so the original way, which was sending a son or brother to England to be the factor and strike the best deal possible for the family, as we covered in our episode on William Lee. That family member could import tobacco from family members and be trusted to sell it at the best price while keeping his family members out of debt. This worked best if the plantations kept up the old habit of taking in tobacco from the yeomen and selling them imported goods in exchange for that tobacco, operating out of the Great House and its facilities. This was done to a huge degree at Stratford Hall, for example, generally keeping the revolutionary generation of Lees out of precarious debts, at least before Light Horse Harry came along, as we'll cover in the future. But this became harder as Scottish merchants took over the yeoman-connected import-export trade in the colony and edged out the planters. But still, it was possible for those who tried. A big problem in this late Golden Age period was that a lot of planters didn't try and so just lost all their money or went deeply into debt. As the imperial crisis deepened through the late 1760s and early 1770s, the various strands of Virginia gentry culture, their tobacco mentality, their self-reliance, and the estates that supported it, their institutional self-governance, their unyielding code of personal honor, and their concept of hegemonic liberty, of course, converged into a single revolutionary force that was no doubt pushed along by the web of transatlantic debt, though it's important not to overstate that. Many claim that debt led to the revolution, but that's just not true. It was just an aggravating factor in a already precarious situation. So when the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, followed by the Townshend Acts and the Coercive Acts, the Virginia gentry responded as one might expect and refused to tolerate such usurpations of their long-trained, long-developed prerogatives. Hence the Westmoreland Resolves, as we covered in that episode, that led to the Revolution. Faced with the choice between humiliating submission and armed resistance, the brilliant aristocracy of Virginia planters chose to fight, to develop their proud tradition of personal independence and corporate self-governance. They mobilized the formidable political skills and administrative experience they had honed over generations within their local parish vestries, county courts, and the House of Burgesses. It was these Tidewater grandees and Northern Neck grandees, men trained from youth in the habit of command, steeped in classical history, and fiercely jealous of their liberty, who stepped forward to lead the Continental resistance. Richard Henry Lee offered the fateful resolution in Congress declaring that the United Colonies were free and independent states. Thomas Jefferson deployed his classical prose to draft the Declaration of Independence. George Mason penned the Virginia Declaration of Rights, creating the archetype for American constitutional liberties. And George Washington, the ultimate Virginia cropmaster, horseman, county magistrate, assumed command of the Continental Army, guiding a fragile, ragged military force through 8 years of grueling war to defeat the mighty British Empire. At the base of all they did, and their success in doing it, stood their culture, the culture we have described, the culture of the Virginia gentry. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you got something out of this episode, found it interesting. I really found researching it interesting and putting it together. So, next time this weekend, I'll be doing an episode covering what I think we as modern Americans should learn from the Virginia gentry, particularly the way they developed themselves in terms of political experience and governing experience. And then I'll get back into the series on the Lees, and as I mentioned earlier, cover the Lees of Lee, Sylvania through Light Horse Harry Lee and his sons, namely Black Horse Harry, who lost Stratford, and Robert E. Lee, who's the most famous. And then we'll get into the generation after Robert E. Lee, which is really the last one of public note. And we'll be done with the family. So I've enjoyed doing all this, and it'll be fun to finish it up with those last collection of lives. Anyway, I really appreciate you listening to this. If you made it to the end, please make sure to like this video. Please share it around. If there's anyone you know who'd be interested in it, I'd really appreciate you sharing it with them, as that's how I grow. That's how I keep this show going. Keep it being worth its while. So thank you again, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.